So usually at the start of our stewardship campaign, at least since I've been here, I've been tasked with giving what has been unofficially called the Sermon on the Amount. Now, I've never actually given the amount during a sermon, but I've tried to come up with sermons that, would be somewhat inspiring or informative about the purpose of our church or why we're here. And I think today's sermon on why I remain a Unitarian and what it means to me does just that. To begin with, Unitarianism is such an obscure and minuscule religion, it is a wonder that anyone even knows it exists, let alone belongs to it. It's estimated there are roughly 800,000 Unitarians worldwide, although that number can be a little higher or more likely is a lot smaller. 800,000 in any case is less than 0.1 or 0.01% of the global population. Almost 0%. So you're mostly not here. Now, pushing its numbers as generously as possible to include 26 emerging congregations, 34 covenanting communities, and 21 international congregations and communities, the Unitarian Universalist Association, of course, here in the U.S., reports having just over 1,000 congregations with around 150,000 individual members. Comparatively, there are more than 1.4 billion Catholics in the world. 53 million of them here in the U.S., making up about 18% of the global population and 19% of Americans. And there are over 17 million Southern Baptists, the largest Protestant denomination in the world. Most of them, about 13 million, are here in the U.S., accounting for about 4% of the country's total population. Now, if you wish to consider a more obscure and relatively small religion, there are almost as many Mormons, Latter-day Saints, in the world as there are Southern Baptists, about 7 million of them here in the U.S., representing about 2% of the country's adult population, compared to Unitarianism's measly 0.01% globally. So much for Thomas Jefferson's 1882 prediction that there is not a young man now living in the U.S. who will not die a Unitarian. So, in light of our dismal numbers, I must conclude that the main reason I became a Unitarian was dumb luck. Although our religion, as Jefferson believed, ought to be America's religion, and the religion of humanity for that matter, at almost 0%, we remain so tiny that the chance of anyone ever learning of our existence, including those who share our values, is a fat chance. A short time ago, for example, I had to establish care with a new doctor who happens to be from Romania, which was formerly the part of Hungary where the Unitarian religion was formally started, or began in the 16th century, where the Hungarian Unitarian Church's headquarters remains today, and where our partner church in Felșoracos, Romania, is located. But upon hearing that I'm a Unitarian minister, my Romanian doctor, who grew up there, said that he'd never heard of our religion before, although he was intrigued by what I had to say about it. Ours is a needle in the haystack of religions that most people in the world don't even know to look for. To make matters worse, many who claim to be Unitarians today, in my opinion, probably are not. They may have joined Unitarian congregations and fellowships, but the definition of our liberal religion, as if it weren't already obscure enough, has become increasingly muddled over time, making it the perfect religious canvas upon which to project one's own religious ideals and yearnings, rather than recognizing it for what it is supposed to be about, or at least once was supposed to be about. I was first introduced to Unitarianism in my 20s by a co-worker familiar enough with it and with me to recommend that I try it. I soon attended a summer service at Thomas Jefferson Unitarian Church in Louisville, Kentucky, during which somebody was dullishly speaking about flower arranging. After that, I had no interest in returning until after Peggy and I got married in 1988 as Southern Baptist refugees. We were missing a church community, but did not miss the superstition and dogmatism that went along with it. So I recommended we try the Unitarian Church, saying something to the effect that they are supposed to be a church community without any creeds. And that is all I knew about Unitarian Universalism at the time. And since there was no internet or search engines in those days, the best way to learn about just about anything was to give it a try. Which we did, which led to a much slower process of becoming what I consider Unitarians in the historic sense of that term. In short, I had joined the Unitarian religion, but I was still a long way from becoming a Unitarian. It's true the church that we joined was a community and did not have any creeds, but there is a lot more to Unitarianism than what it is not. To compound the problem of trying to understand what it is about, in 1961, the American Unitarian Association merged with the Universalist Church of America, forming an undefined hybrid religion that had never existed before, which is why to this day researchers refer to Unitarian Universalism as an NRM, a new religious movement, even though the two denominations had existed separately for centuries. They had considered such an association for more than a century before, but were reluctant to make it happen because of some seemingly insurmountable, theological and class differences. The rather unexpected and I believe ill-conceived merger left these differences unresolved and left the relatively few members they had already wondering what in the hell a Unitarian Universalist is, even though half of them didn't believe in hell. The newly formed association didn't talk much about its namesake's roots for fear of raising those old divisions that had long prevented such a merger. Instead, it forged ahead by adding 6 defining principles to its new bylaws, which became 7 principles in 1985. They also immediately began sending out surveys asking, "Who are we?" Right? What are we about? And they're still sending them out. The answers they receive have become increasingly uncertain over the decades, and their principles, meaningful as they may be to some, are shallow compared to the rich history and theological depth of both these once independent and very old denominations. Unitarian Universalism, the new religious movement formed in 1961, has increasingly struggled to define what it is about, transforming itself into a blank canvas, as mentioned, upon which a variety of people can project their personal religious and pseudo-religious ideas and beliefs. I sometimes call it the everything bagel of religions. And I often hear outsiders ask, "Oh, isn't that the religion that believes everything?" When in truth is we don't believe much of anything, right? And this notion has resulted most recently in its capture by ideological extremists and opportunists who understand and care so little about its historic values and principles that they have abandoned even its 7 principles from 1985, along with its fair and democratic election processes, and have excommunicated more ministers in the past 6 years, including me, for saying things they disagree with, than they had disfellowshipped altogether during the previous 60 years. Its new leaders even associate both these venerable traditions, which were among the most active and vocal in both the abolitionist movement and the civil rights movement, with white supremacy. Whatever this NRM has become, it does not represent Unitarianism or Universalism anymore, if it ever did. Then I recently tried to found and shape a new association for the purpose of reconnecting us with our historic roots and values, the North American Unitarian Association, NAUA. Sadly, it turned into a fool's errand, for there are too many among us who prefer the shallow religion based on a few simple credo-like statements, the 7 principles that were written by the Unitarian Universalist Association in 1985, rather than the deeper meaning of our liberal religious heritage that formally dates back to at least the Renaissance. In his 2-volume work, A History of Unitarianism, written in 1945, Unitarian minister and scholar Earl Morse Wilbur summarized Unitarianism's fundamental principles as freedom, reason, and tolerance. These, he says, have evolved in its history and been ever increasingly realized as the necessary conditions of the fullest development of religious thought and life. Wilbur died 5 years before the establishment of the Unitarian Universalist Association, upon which it is said that a mound of dirt mysteriously appeared in front of his tombstone, indicating that he had turned over in his grave. There's your Easter resurrection story, guys. That's as close as we're going to get. Human dignity maintained through freedom, reason, and tolerance were the simple values claimed by NAUA, which I insisted remain no more than a service and support organization, not a denomination, not a religious headquarters, and not a place for our members to store their personal versions of the 10 Commandments, the 4 Noble Truths, the 5 Pillars, the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, or whatever it is they wanted us to codify for them. As autonomous individuals and congregations. And this is part of what makes me a Unitarian. As autonomous and individual congregations, it was up to them to articulate their own principles and encode them wherever they wish, hopefully upon their own hearts, which is the only place that really counts. But as one member complained, I just want NAUA to become like the UUA before it went crazy. A sentiment I now realize is endemic among those claiming to be Unitarians and UUs. And I won't go into the ugly details, but I left NAUA abruptly after a coup had been orchestrated by a couple of board members who, as one of them said, did not sign up for this and seems to have wanted to turn NAUA into what the UUA was before it went crazy. My only regret is that my name will be forever associated as its founder, because I don't wish to be remembered for establishing another shallow, cultish religious association. In fact, its rogue board began talking about adopting the 7 principles within the very same week as my resignation, making it the opposite of the association I, along with others in our church here, began. I may have initially become a Unitarian because of dumb luck. But in light of everything I've just shared, why on earth do I remain a Unitarian? I think it's because I do value its deep roots, its history, and its perennial values more than most anything else in my life. No matter how flawed and distorted its institutions have become, no matter how imperfectly we as individuals have been able to live up to its values and ideals, Unitarianism remains worthy of my devotion to its highest aspirations. When we are able to get past the institutional trappings and the hypocritical behavior of some of its proponents and adherents, I still believe Unitarianism offers humanity the best approach for creating a far more humane and peaceful world, and that it is the best path for us to live as individuals. As much as I do cherish reason, freedom, and tolerance, I consider Unitarianism's devotion to human dignity to be its most fundamental principle upon which everything else rests. Unitarianism may have been formally founded in the 16th century, in 16th century Transylvania, when it became the religion of King John Sigismund Zapolya. But the idea has literally been around since Christ, or more precisely, since historical Jesus. His followers were Jews, who may have revered him as a rabbi, maybe even seen him as their Messiah, but never as a God, which would have been anathema to any Jew, including Jesus himself. It wasn't until Christianity became the official religion of Rome, right, almost 3 centuries beyond his crucifixion, that they, having had a tradition of deifying human beings among these Gentiles, if you will, began calling him God. Those who argued eg osh eschin, as our friends in Felshirachos do, God is one, the one Jesus worshipped, were for this very reason theologically Unitarian. But in 325 CE, Emperor Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea to declare that the Father and the Son were one in order to settle the growing debate over his divine status once and for all. 50 years later, the Council of Constantinople added the Holy Spirit to the recipe, and Trinitarian doctrine was officially born. So if you didn't follow that, for the record, Trinitarianism was born 4 centuries after Jesus' life and death. 4 centuries. In reaction against Unitarianism. Not the other way around. We were here first. Dating back long before Trinitarian doctrine. Of course, it wasn't called Unitarianism back then, but that's what it was. And inherent within it was the idea that Jesus was but a human being. Theologians refer to this as a low Christology, or as I prefer to say, a humanistic Christology. Right? The high Christology is where you believe almost entirely in Jesus' divinity, and a low Christology almost entirely in his humanity. Well, it doesn't get any lower than Unitarianism. Because we believe that was it. Jesus was considered a human being, but a very special human being because he uplifted other human beings, right? There's the resurrection story. What, you got some coconuts in your pocket there, Don? Jesus is tenderly calling. That's okay, my friend. No worries. But this is the resurrection story, really, right? Jesus raised humans up, right? Especially those who had been demonized and dehumanized. So from its very inception, this humanistic theology, this humanistic Christology, emphasized the inherent worth and dignity of every person. The idea that still most defines what it means to be liberal in our religion or otherwise. That's what it means to be liberal. To value human dignity. And after the end of the Dark Ages, when the invention of the printing press, with the invention of the printing press and its democratization of the Bible, it became apparent to some that the revered book contained no mention of the Trinity the church authorities had long been speaking of. Theologian Michael Servetus soon wrote a book of his own about this marvelous discovery for which he was burned at the stake, and today remains known as the father of Unitarianism, of the theological idea called Unitarianism. And little more than a decade later, good King John Sigismund made Unitarianism his religion, not because of its theology, but because it preached tolerance for the people of all faiths. It was Sigismund who then issued the first religious toleration law in human history, the Edict of Torda, in 1568, allowing people in his kingdom to practice whatever religion they chose without fear of persecution or prosecution or punishment. Sigismund chose Unitarianism and issued the Edict of Torda because he knew peace could not otherwise be maintained in his unusually diverse kingdom. That was the religion necessary. So from its formal inception, we find most of what Wilbur saw and summarized for us: freedom to choose, think and speak for ourselves, and tolerance of those who choose, think, and speak differently than ourselves. But what about reason? Where does reason come in? As people with a strong humanistic bent, Unitarians are inclined to value human reason and rely upon human agency. Right? That's what respecting humanity does. Let humans think for themselves and choose for themselves and act for themselves. And this results in great respect for logic and science. And this is why when our particular church was founded in 1887, its bylaws stated, the authority of its belief is reason. The method of finding its beliefs is scientific. Its aim is to crush superstition and establish the facts of religion. It's why my famous predecessor here, the Reverend John Dietrich, called the term Unitarianism incidental, since a disbelief in the Trinitarian formula has little to do with what our religion is really all about. Rather, they were Unitarians and rejected the dogma of the Trinity, he said, because they were liberals and placed themselves under the command of reason and accepted the modern discoveries of science and history. So the theological concept of Unitarianism really hasn't been that big a deal to us. It's also why Dietrich praised the great 19th century orator and atheist Robert Ingersoll, as you heard me speak of a couple weeks ago, is the most ardent champion of freedom from superstition. But the more fundamental point of reason is not using it to advance science and end superstition, but to simply let others think for themselves. It is to accept, in the name of human dignity and agency, that humankind is a rational animal, and that every individual, therefore, ought to be free to use reason and to draw their own conclusions. And here's the key point: without the need for a church or state to issue creeds or decrees telling them what they can or can't believe. So these three core values, which freedom, which refers to the freedom to choose, to speak, to think for oneself, and to fully participate in the benefits of society without prejudice. Reason, which refers to thinking well, but more importantly, to respecting the ability of others to reason for themselves without getting mad because they disagree with us or say something we disagree with, or worse than mad. And tolerance, which requires us, even when we do disagree, to not only live and let live, but to protect the freedoms and the rights and the dignity of those we disagree with. This is why I consider this Unitarian trinity of values, if you will, reason, freedom, and tolerance, to be the social technologies necessary to advance our greater goal of establishing and maintaining human dignity. Right? If you think about human dignity, how can it be maintained without freedom, reason, and tolerance? That's what creates the dignified life, the dignified situation. And it is what Unitarianism means to me and why I remain a Unitarian. Because its humanistic ethic is my ethic. It's fundamental to who I am. Sometimes I feel like I'm a Unitarian dinosaur, part of a religion that is rapidly going extinct. I feel fortunate to be the minister of such a historic church, especially one that has embraced human dignity from its inception, along with the principles of reason, freedom, and tolerance necessary to foster it. But during my 15 years here, I have encountered plenty whom I believe, as Dietrich also put it, became identified with Unitarianism by some mistake. Maybe they were born into it and consider Unitarianism a birthright. But we don't accept infant membership any more than we accept infant baptism. Unitarianism is a religion of adults, and understand what it's about and intentionally choose it for themselves. So great is our historic respect for individual freedom of choice. Others may think they are Unitarians because it allows them to believe whatever they want. That's true. Believe whatever you want, please. But Unitarianism is not about what you believe as an individual. It's far more about how you treat those who believe different than you. That's Unitarianism. How do you treat those who believe differently than you? Treating them with respect and dignity. Merely being born into it, merely believing whatever you want, merely signing our membership book doesn't make you a Unitarian. Some who have may have been here by mistake. But as I said at the start, for me, joining the Unitarian Church was only the beginning of a much longer process of becoming a Unitarian. So even if you might be here by mistake, stick around. It may just be your dumb luck that you'll become a Unitarian yet. And that's what happened in my case. And the more I have learned about and come to understand this peculiar religion, the more I have realized how perfectly it reflects my greatest values and highest aspirations. And the more I have come to see that I really am a Unitarian. And maybe, deep down, I always have been. And even if I am a Unitarian dinosaur, so be it. Because I would rather go extinct with a fading truth that honors human dignity than to join the crowd that has forgotten it. Thank you. Thank you.